Hello, I'm Evan Manning, and this is Module 3, the three-prong interviews for EDL 853 VA in the fall. The overview of the assignment: relationships in other areas of the building can provide you with a welcome break from what you may be a tense working environment, as well as helping you to further your knowledge about the organization you are working for, as well as people working for the organization. And that corresponds with the standard E1A. I think that although that was sort of the dictionary definition, if you will, of the overview, the opportunity to see multiple perspectives on the issue of special education was both helpful and eye-opening. Honestly, it was almost overwhelming a little bit to really see the amount of caring that uh, we have as staff members for special education individuals. And again, as a regular ed focused teacher, again, although I do have a fairly high percentage of special ed students with the freshman communications class that I teach, especially, and obviously a few considerations with English 9, the amount of percentage of focus and pre-planning that I'm spending on logistical implementation is extremely different overall percentage-wise than the paraprofessional or the assistant administrator slash counselor, or even obviously the special education teacher. And it really felt like seeing that and that passion and focus that the three individuals that I interviewed had were just really, I said, eye-opening and a little bit overwhelming. It also really made me feel like afterwards, like what can I do better to try to facilitate the ability for them to get to do better what they know and what they do. And it really feels like I really, after this assignment, have an urge to try to make sure that I am planning with curriculum as well as planning what I'm doing with the individual decision making and planning that I do to really try to incorporate those visions. So I really think that the overall overview of the assignment was really interesting, and one that I am appreciative for having. The second part of the overview is just the individuals that I actually interviewed. The first person I interviewed was a current paraprofessional who helps students during two of my class periods. So we have a 6 hour day. Of those six, I basically have this specific paraprofessional for 1/3 of the day. So someone who knows me and my classes. It's also in two different classes, one in English 9 and one in communications, so sort of slightly different perspectives. But it's someone that I do know some about, but also does have other experiences as well outside of my classroom. Two is an assistant principal at the high school level of my high school, and that assistant principal also has a key role in counseling, which I thought is interesting, especially when dealing with like the rosters and the graduation requirements and the individual needs that they had for setting schedules, especially integrating that into the regular education classrooms, which I thought was interesting. And third was a special education teacher at a neighboring high school. And the individuals I coached that I know through tennis, so getting to have like a personal one-on-one interview with that person was helpful and interesting. Question number one focused on the child fine procedures, which again, personally, I didn't know really anything about. I was actually curious what that is originally, and that was interesting for me. The special education teacher that I interviewed indicated there's a few different things that they use. And again, a lot of the stuff it felt like we were getting during the entire interview process was overlapping. So I really tried to, instead of listing three or four, excuse me, three or four things that everyone said, I really tried to try to focus on the things that were individual and like the distinctions between them. The special education teacher indicated that both teacher referrals and parent interventions, and then the past school reforms, obviously, if they had, for example, an IEP or through the GEI team of the past school referrals, then obviously that usually transfers with them, at least at first. They also indicated the BASC3 rating scale, sort of teacher evaluation protocol. I've actually never seen this in person, but after getting a copy, it was a very intensive sheet with I think there was like 150 something questions on it, that were all sorts of different indicators for services and needs, and accommodation. And although, again, a little overwhelming with the sheer number of questions, it was obviously very involved and something that I would be interested if we would ever use here. The administrator talked specifically about teacher input and the GEI team, which is something they have there, as well as the ACT Aspire scores to help identify students in need of reading support. So I thought that was something that was also interesting. And then the paraprofessional indicated that for this specific question, that it's not applicable for her. So that's what I put. Moving on, the most challenging job duty, which was question number 2. Again, the special education teacher indicated the paperwork that they have is something that is really demanding for them. And again, that's something that I don't really get to see. I know that every once in a while we'll get evaluations or assessments that we have to do. But again, usually for me personally, they're very specifically tailored to what I'm doing in my class for a specific student. So I don't have like quite the pile up, if you will, of those needs. But even just listing some of the examples of what they were, definitely overwhelming. The administrator indicated that again, sort of focusing on the counseling aspect, struggling with finding elective courses that are appropriate for our students, fewer offerings in special education classes, and flexibility in scheduling electives drastically is determined when special education modifications and needs were discussed. And the paraprofessional discussed multiple needs for multiple students in a single class setting. And again, that might be something that I sort of took for granted. When you're teaching regular ed, it's sort of like you teach to the standard and then you sort of keep that for everyone and then hope that everyone gets up there for mastery in a perfect world. But when you have different students with different needs and different levels of what mastery would look like, I didn't really think about that before, but she did a really good job of articulating like the amount that she has to do to specifically alter or modify individual work depending upon what the class is for 3 or 4 different students in the same class. And again, they're not all achieving to the same endpoint, and that was again just something that was really interesting, I thought, for the challenge of that, and it definitely seemed very challenging. Question number 3 was the most rewarding portion. Special education teacher, personal relationships with individual students, and then something that I didn't really think about much either was creating a pathway for students in the LRE, which was the least restrictive environment. That was something that I felt was interesting that they would choose as the most rewarding portion. But again, I think after talking with that person, that when you have an individual who sort of gets quote unquote stuck in a specific setting, and to get to break out of that and be with their newfound friends in a much more open social setting, and you get to see that child flourish in that was a really rewarding portion of their job for them, and something that again I wouldn't necessarily think of, but I felt was really interesting for them. The administrator seeing the students walk across the stage with diplomas in hand, and I thought again we think about the focus and maybe even take it for granted a bit where I am in our specific school setting, that graduation is very much something that we assume every student has the ability to do. But again, with special education modifications and needs, you probably have even more sort of rewarding experiences getting some of those students to get to achieve those goals that everyone else did. And maybe when it's even just slightly not as assured, then the reward can feel that much higher. And third, the paraprofessional, reoccurring relationships with students and allowing for deeper help and correction for individual students. Again, I can sort of put myself in this a little bit when I have debate kids for 3 or 4 consecutive years, or tennis players for 3 or 4 consecutive seasons. You sort of get to build upon those relationships, and the depth of those relationships can obviously give you a better insight to those students and really feel like you're impacting them at a larger level. And when I see one student for 1 hour of the day out of 130, again, that just compartmentalizes the amount of help I can give any one student. But for someone who has a caseload of maybe the same 12 or 15 students and following them around, maybe getting to see them multiple times in a day, multiple that by multiple years, you really feel like you are one with that student and getting to achieve those goals. And I felt that was a really interesting take from the para. Question 4 was supervision advice. The special education teacher went into more depth in this, but I felt like the overall theme or thesis was planning and really talking about how with supervision specifically, if you have to think about how are you supervising your regular education class and your individual students in like an inclusion setting on the spot, it's already too late. There were interesting stories about scenarios where you're having to leave to go talk to a student, or you're having to send a special education student with a para, or send them to like a study skills room, and all of a sudden, who knows what happens, and all of a sudden the breakdowns occur. And being able to plan ahead of time for what you're going to do in those moments, and how as the individual teacher you are going to be able to deal with least restrictive environment protocols, I thought was something that I know I don't do enough thinking about as a regular ed teacher, and something that I'm definitely going to start thinking of in the future. The assistant administrator talked about special education paras can make or break the inclusion classroom setting. It's extremely important to have expectations clearly outlined before classes begin. I think, again, not me personally, but from the administrator's perspective, trying to have those outlines for the paras to be on the same page with what is expected of them can be good. And I don't know personally, might be from a perspective of having some negative experiences with para support. Again, not me. But I think that if that were to happen, obviously then clearly defining those things so that everyone is on the same page and there's some clarity could be important. And obviously that was sort of a focus there with supervision advice. And 3, from the paraprofessional specifically, working in advance with regular education teachers on location and separation plans. It was interesting how the assistant administrator kind of talked about what we should do to help the paras, and the paras sort of discussed what regular education teachers can help with for them. And then the special education teacher also kind of put it back on the regular education teacher as really focusing on that plan ahead of time. Yet that's not something really that we get talked much about early on in the sort of off season, if you will, of school, where I could start modifying plans. So I do think that is something that as an administrator, we are going to want to talk with more to our staff ahead of time. Question 5 is parent connectivity. This was one that I was sort of scared about, potentially having some negative answers or consequences for what was said. Obviously, I think we all get a little bit scared about talking with parents about anything that's super impactful or important to parents' lives, and what more could be important to them than making sure that their student is getting a fair and the best possible education that they can. And obviously, with special education services, that's going to be something on there. But really, the answers were fairly straightforward. The special education teacher indicated that continuous communication and collaboration with the parents was important. And again, really hinted at even some stories maybe of too much communication with parents, including daily connections or logs, email chains in order to connect with parents. Again, that seems overwhelming, I think would be the word as well that I would use there. But obviously, that connectivity is super important. 2, from the assistant administrator, we have a move-in meeting for our new and district students, annual IEPs, and then lots of and physical mail that goes back and forth, really trying to continue pushing policies to make sure that everyone's aware of any changes, and that attendance in the meetings is super important, was something that was also stressed by the administrator. And the paraprofessional. So when the first gut response I got was as little as possible, and at first, with a little bit of a laugh, I was like, well, as a teacher, I think in a perfect world, I agree with you. But she actually had a really interesting take on this, which is that we advocate for the child as much as possible, like trying to take cues from the caseworker, and that our specific job really is not to try to directly communicate with the parent, right? Like we are the person who is supposed to help the child. Like we're the advocate for the child here at school and in that classroom setting. And ultimately, we communicate with the caseworker, but the caseworker is the one who communicates and is the advocate for the parent, making sure that like standards and the guidelines are met. So again, agree or disagree with it. I thought that was an interesting response, and sort of different than what I was expecting. Question 5, which is regular education cooperation. The special education teacher indicated that our best gateway to seeing students in least restrictive environments, as well as seeing social needs